I'd like to highlight something a little different around kind of challenging the norms in a highly regulated field like myself and biotech and pharma. So for me as a young engineer coming through these big companies with these processes that have been reiterated time and time again, I found that just kind of questioning the status quo has been a differentiator for me. There's a standard practice for how you're doing work, and like as a younger engineer, you can be timid or potentially even a little taken back by some of the management or senior engineers. You don't want to question why things are done. But for me, just it shows a level of interest and it forces people to think, right? Because there might be a decision on why that was made or how that was made that you might not be aware of, and that's fine. But there could also be an opportunity to make really impactful change. And if you're thinking about it, there's a good likelihood someone else is thinking about it too.
This is Facility Rockstars, the podcast that celebrates the unsung heroes of our daily lives, facility professionals. I'm your host, Jay Culbert. Join me as we honor these great leaders, sharing stories, insights, and expertise that empower us all to learn and grow together. Facility Rockstars is sponsored by Colludus, operating the way you operate in order to make your life easier. Welcome back to Facility Rockstars. I'm your host, Jay Culbert, and I am thrilled to have a truly dynamic guest joining us with over a decade's worth of experience in both the engineering and facilities industry. He brings a wealth of expertise in managing complex operations. He oversees everything from facilities management and process engineering to maintenance, metrology, and CQV, ensuring not only operational excellence, but also stringent regulatory compliance. His work supports both business growth and client innovation, making him a pivotal figure in advancing cutting-edge solutions in the biopharmaceutical industry. He is the Director of Facilities and Engineering at Recipharm. Mike Temple, welcome to the show.
Thank you for that flattering introduction, Jay. I appreciate it. And this is my first time on a podcast, so I'm glad to be here with you.
Glad you're here, Mike. Thanks for taking your time.
Yeah, no problem.
All right, man. So I'm going to ask you, you've heard this question before. With all of your experience and all of the jobs you've had and responsibilities, what's been your biggest lesson learned as a facilities manager?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And as I was thinking about this, I think there's a lot of good answers to this question when it comes to like stakeholder engagement or communication. But I'd like to highlight something a little different around kind of challenging the norms in a highly regulated field like myself and biotech and pharma. So for me as a young engineer, kind of coming through these big companies with these processes that have been reiterated time and time again, I found that just kind of questioning the status quo has been a differentiator for me. So, right, like if there's a standard practice for how you're doing work, and like as a younger engineer, you can be timid or potentially even a little taken back by some of the management or senior engineers. You don't want to question why things are done. But for me, just it shows a level of interest, and it shows it because it forces people to think, right? Because there might be a decision on why that was made or how that was made that you might not be aware of, and that's fine. But there could also be an opportunity to make really impactful change, and if you're thinking about it, there's a good likelihood someone else is thinking about it too. So for me, it's something that someone else actually mentioned to me. So a mentor and a friend, he actually was like, if you see something, sort of ask the question, because the worst you can look is curious, which to me is, I think a positive thing. So I think that's definitely one of the biggest takeaways I've had. And then another one that I'd like to mention as well is just around kind of doing the little things right and kind of controlling what you can control. This same kind of mentor friend, he actually gave me some critical feedback early on in my career, which is another lesson learned is getting critical feedback. But for this, he gave it to me, and it was probably uncomfortable. But I think what I learned from that is, if you can do the little things right, such as, showing up on time, showing up prepared to meetings, your attitude for how you address certain problems or scenarios or situations, that's the stuff you can control. Because I mean, in this world, that's really a lot. Like there's so many different things that can happen. So I think that was some great advice that I got on. And, what was it a little uncomfortable at first? Yes. But I think if you're able to do the little stuff right, it builds those winning habits. And I think that can have a positive impact on your career growth.
This is great stuff, Mike. And so so valid for everyone who's just beginning their career or those who've been in their career for so long. So my question is, how did you gain the confidence to be bold and ask those questions of, superiors or leaders or management when you're just starting out? How did you build that confidence?
No, I think that's a great question. And honestly, I think what allowed me the ability to ask those questions to people was bouncing it off of people that I felt comfortable with first. So building your own network of people that you can just say like, hey, why is this being done the way it's done? Do you know? Or like, who should I even ask about this? And I think developing that professional network, or even people within your personal life that, might be in the same industry or something adjacent, to just be able to, kind of you have that comfortability with. And I think if you can get that with someone, you feel a little bit more confident. You're like, hey, I'm not crazy for questioning why this is done a certain way. So I think that's kind of what allowed me to do that.
Awesome. So how is it received? Right? Some may feel challenged when being asked a question about a directive or something. So how was that received? And you
Yeah,
said,
I've always had positive feedback when it comes to like asking those questions. There might be like a little bit of angst when it comes to like, okay, maybe the change that it would need to actually fix this issue might be a little too broad, or it might not be within the budget. But at least for me, I think the leadership that I've had in the past, they've always been like, huh, well, that's a good point. I didn't even think about it that way. Or it's been like, oh, due to this or this, we weren't able to actually fix that. So this is our standard process for now, but we've, recognized it as an issue or something like that. So
Mhm.
I really haven't had any negative feedback towards it at all.
That's awesome. Good for you. You also mentioned a friend and a mentor. So
Mhm.
this has come up on the show. It's certainly come up throughout my career. How did you find this person? Because a lot of people try to figure out, how do I find that coach or that mentor, or someone I can learn from? How did you do that?
So for me, I will say, so I went to Mass Maritime Academy for my undergraduate, and there is an amazing alumni network when it comes to that. So I actually did a road race with someone prior to graduating, and he just happened to have also gone to Mass Maritime, was in biotech, and we just got to kind of chatting at the end of the race. And he was like, "Hey, you should look at this company if you're graduating soon, blah blah blah." So. And then ever since then, he was just kind of a critical figure, someone I'd like text if I had issues, someone I'd, call on if I wanted to, bounce ideas off of. And I think just kind of being open to events like that, like doing a road race and feeling okay talking to specific people. Or I know there's tons of industry events, like ISP does some great stuff. There's the product show at Gillette every year that I try to attend when I can, that I think is an awesome networking opportunity for people in industry. So I think just being able to just go there, because it's tough to I understand it's tough to network, especially in an engineering function. Like there is a ton of hesitancy, and it's not necessarily what amps you up at the end of the day, but it's good to just realize that there are other people having similar problems and be able to bounce them off of them at these types of events.
We've talked about that a lot, the networking, putting yourself out there.
Mm-hmm.
Great stuff on your mentor, by the way, and good for you for doing it. And yes, I agree. ISP is a great resource, and that Gillette event is huge. It's a big event.
Yeah, it's next week.
It is. It is. Are you going?
Yeah, I'll be there. I will be there. My
Awesome.
whole team will be there. I'm trying to get everyone to go.
We'll see you there. I'll be there
Yeah,
too.
definitely.
Awesome. Let's talk about communication a bit, Mike, with your team. Like, how do you communicate with multiple parties? And when I say that, I mean, leadership, finance, EH&S, vendors, your team. How do you coordinate all of that?
Yeah, I think that's critical to having a successful operations team. And I think for me, where I start is I try to have what I call these like pre-conversations. So if you're starting a project, or if you're starting an initiative, or you have this scenario that you're like, this could impact a multitude of different facets in the organization, I like to just have these like informal conversations to just be like, for people that I know that are going to have to be a part of this, and just kind of see what their thoughts are on it. Like if it's a project, I'm like, hey, this is what this might cost. This is what I'm thinking. And what that allows me to do is it's a very easy way to just learn someone's perspective on something. Also understand I've also had this happen to me a ton in the past, is they'll actually bring up other people that I wouldn't have known their needs except for talking to this person. So it almost broadens that stakeholder impact or network, or however you want to call it. But it basically, having these conversations has allowed me to figure out, at least get a base level of what the needs are and which groups to involve and really who to involve. And then I like to kind of abide by the 2 to 3 forms of communication model.
Mhm.
So then I'll probably have some sort of meeting with all the stakeholders after having these conversations. We kind of go over the plan, or depending on what the scenario or whatever it may be. And that meeting, it just is kind of more of an open forum where people can, they're already aware of it, but they might have concerns. They might have other needs that they're not sure if I'm meeting or someone else is meeting. And so for me, being able to kind of air out whatever the scenario or project might be and get everyone's input, and then following that up with meeting minutes or detailed meeting minutes and action items, and also the plan moving forward, especially in terms of like project management. I think that's where you can even establish, like, how do you guys want to be communicated to? Is it email? Is it phone calls? Is it, a biweekly meeting? So I think being able to determine that as a group and how you manage that stuff is huge. As well as for me, I love the whole after action meeting minutes notes, just because it reminds me of, I did say that I would do that. So I think it gives people another forum to say, okay, like they might forget the conversation 10 minutes later, but now they have an email stating that they need to do X thing.
I love how you said, how do you want to be, or you ask, how do you want to be communicated to? So do you flex every time when the receiving party says something that you don't typically do? So do you just flex your team and cater to them?
Yeah, I think typically we've kind of done like a hybrid approach in the past, because, the way you communicate to management is different than you communicate to the project team or a vendor. So I think we do try to tailor it a little bit towards different people. And sometimes everyone agrees to the same thing. Sometimes, management wants X. They just want to know, are we on track? Are we on budget? And that's it. Whereas, some of the more detailed facets, such as like engineering or the manufacturing team, they want to know, like, when is this going to be here? And they want detailed scheduling updates. So I think you do have to kind of tailor it to the person. And, it might be a little bit more time consuming, but I think it pays dividends in the later parts of the project.
Excellent. So we all know that project management isn't usually a straight line. We plan it out and something goes sideways. How do you handle that? Like, how do you handle diversions from or deviations from the plan?
Yeah, that's it's one of the toughest things, because you have this detailed plan that you've spent months mapping out, and then something goes off the rails. But I think for me that comes down to communication, because the first thing everyone needs to do is just be notified. Whether it's a delay in materials, it could be an equipment issue or whatever. I think it's just getting the right people in the room to discuss whatever that deviation might be. And so for me, I know we use Teams, so my first action or my team's action is typically to just blast it out to the project team and say, like, hey, this is what we're seeing. I'll set up some time, but just so everybody's aware, here's the issue. And that's kind of the initial, like, hey, there's the problem. And then I think we either have a smaller subset team where we kind of come up with a path forward, and then potentially any ways to get back on track or whatever. And then that's what we present to the overall project group.
Good process. Sounds excellent. So I'm going to jump to safety, Mike.
Yeah.
We talk a lot about safety on the show and in our world in general, right? It's paramount. It's non-negotiable. So what are some of the key elements about safety within your facility, and how do you guys ensure compliance with them or to them?
Yeah. This is an interesting topic for us right now, just because my organization has recently taken over safety. So we had this really strong director of EHS, and she was great, and she implemented a ton of awesome programs that I've been able to see over the last 3 years. So for us, the way that we ensure compliance has really been around like the data-driven metric side of it. So these leading and lagging indicators of how we're performing from a safety perspective. So that can be anything from OSHA recordables, lost time incidents, which obviously we strive for zero. And then it could be Good Catch program involvement. So Good Catch is our kind of version of like see something, say something. It's just an online portal that we use. There's QR codes every 10 feet in the facility that you can scan with your phone and submit a good catch. And then the safety action committee will review that, assign investigations, assign any CAPAs to the appropriate folks.
Can you talk a little bit more about the Good Catch program? I don't think that that phrase has come up previously, and I love the QR codes everywhere in the facility. So who does it? Give us a couple examples how that would play out.
So one of the interesting ones we found recently was, so we have in our manufacturing facility, we have these tacky mats outside of our gown in area. And so that's really meant to just kind of trap dirt as people are walking in. But when these are very new, they can be, quite sticky. So someone actually put in a Good Catch surrounding that it took someone's shoe off while they were walking in, which I thought was when you first read it, you're like, that's kind of funny, but it did, present an opportunity to what I think can drive meaningful change, right? So we ended up moving to a completely different solution, an electrostatic solution that actually is not about the stickiness of the product. It's more around how it pulls stuff electrostatically off your shoes. And so we were able to implement a safer, more sustainable option, and actually ended up even saving us money because those things are basically, disposable. You basically peel it off every 8 hours, 6 hours, depending on what your procedure says. And so, but these you clean, every other day, and then you're fine.
I have a question about
Sure.
that. So, a lot of our listeners are in your world, or very close to your world and what you do every day.
Mhm.
How did you discover that solution to the tacky mats, and what could you share that would help others? How'd
Yeah.
you discover it?
So for me, that's something I actually implemented at a previous facility. So I had experience with these
Mhm.
before because there was some supply chain issues surrounding these tacky mats, especially during the COVID time. So we had to kind of pivot to a more sustainable solution that we could kind of manage in-house. And so for me, after doing a number of research on Google and then potentially going to some of these like ISPE events, we kind of found these products. And so I had experience from the past. So I was like, hey, why don't we just, you know, do some cost analysis on this, see if it would work for us. And it ended up being a good solution.
Outstanding. I like the leading lagging metrics. You use the data. You brought up EH&S, and now they're under your umbrella or in your team. And a common discussion is how do you continue to foster that relationship with facilities and EH&S? Because sometimes it can be a push pull, right?
Mhm.
Sometimes EH&S may pull back a little bit on the deliverable because something isn't safe or there's something else, another step that has to be taken. How do you manage that?
Yeah, I will say our team has reacted pretty well to it. And for me, what I've really tried to do is more ingrain the safety culture into our processes, because the first thing to go when you're up against it, up against a deadline or something goes wrong, is those things tend to just fall by the wayside, right?
Mhm.
But if it's built into the process, it's not really even an option, right? Like if you have a standard of work and you have steps 1 through 5, and step 3 is that safety requirement, you're not skipping that because that's just part of your normal repertoire of how you go through something. So for me, it's really trying to ingrain it in the process. And then I think stakeholder involvement is probably what I would consider the biggest thing, just because there's a number of ways like you can implement a safety culture. But I think if you get the end users involved in the discussion, involved in the solutions, and involved in making some of these decisions, they feel more empowered and they feel some sense of ownership around it. And so when you do that, I've seen way better results.
Makes sense. Are they happy that they were integrated into the facilities team?
Actually, so we are in the current we are trying to hire an EHS manager right now. So we have someone else that's just kind of handling it, but it's been a good learning experience for I think the team.
Good stuff.
Yeah.
All right, let's talk about regulatory authorities and agencies who will come in and audit your facility. How and
Mhm.
when do you prepare for these visits? This is a big part of your world, Mike. So I know you have a lot to offer here, a lot to
Oh
discuss.
yeah, definitely. I mean, this is critical. This is kind of our bread and butter, so to speak, when it comes to drug manufacturing. And I think for me, just how we prepare, we do a couple of things. Luckily or unluckily, we have a lot of client audits. So I consider that to be good like practice and repetition when it comes to like the big game, so to speak, when like the FDA shows up or the EU shows up and they're doing those audits. So getting through those client audits for all these different processes we've done has definitely got us into a good rhythm. It's identified gaps that we've assessed and actually corrected. And then so that's definitely been something that I've found valuable. And then we also do internal audits. So at least a minimally of yearly, we go through with our quality department and they audit our function. And I think sometimes that can end up being a paperwork exercise. But for us, I think this year specifically, we've taken some feedback on it, and I think it's provided a lot of value in terms of the type of feedback we're getting. So this year, I mean, I think we dove into the things that we're weak in, and we've identified gaps and some really good paths forward for things that we've been, I don't want to say lacking in the past, but at least just something that we know we can improve upon moving forward, especially as you get into like the later stage products in phase like 1, 2, 3. So for us, that's been huge. And then one of the other two things that I'd like to mention in this is pre-audit walkthroughs. So this is something that, at the larger companies I've been at it was a part of the culture. It was a part of how you did business, right? If you have an audit coming or if you have an inspection coming, a month beforehand, you went through and you walked with the management team in your specific area, the facility, and got it ready for the audit. And I think that's super valuable and something that we're trying to implement here currently. And it's nice because it gets management into see the actual conditions of the facility or how the processes work, but then it also just allows you to notice things that maybe they even don't, but you just make a little note and you're like, oh yeah, we probably should take a look at this or change that. And then one thing that I'm also doing with my engineering team is building this repertoire of, I would call them like audit presentations. And so the different parts of my team is just kind of building these out for the different programs, right? So let's say we have the HEPA certification program, we have something around like the cascade and environmental conditions, the clean rooms, and having them build out a few slides kind of summarizing these different programs. Not only does it give them like a better understanding of that program, I think, but it also gives us a almost quick reference guide to be able to, look back on in the middle of an audit to say, okay, what are the 3 procedures that, kind of govern this process? Okay, they're right here. So for me, I think that's something that I've always found to be super helpful and useful, especially in terms of like a regulatory audit, even if you don't end up presenting it.
Sure. It sounds I'll say this, very thorough, right? It sounds extremely thorough. So good on you guys. So a couple follow-up questions on that. What's the most common or most scrutinized thing from these agencies that come through? And then what's the most challenging thing you've found to be in compliance with?
Yeah. I will say there's a couple of things that always get brought up in audits, and pest control is always a big one. Yeah, I mean, it seems to be like an overlooked program, but it's always one that that the regulatory agencies focus on. Environmental monitoring is another one. So like, are you maintaining the classification of clean room that you want, and and they want to see the data behind it. And then also around so we have water for injection, which is basically just like a high purity water system. And that always gets looked at, whether it's the data, the maintenance, calibrations associated with it, how we assess how the calibrations are done. Those are things that are commonly looked at. And sorry, what was the second part of your question?
The most challenging to comply with, and it may be a similar answer, right? Like maybe pest control is the most challenging thing for you to be in compliance with.
I would say for me, the most challenging thing to be compliant with is alarm response. So in a large facility, you have hundreds of pieces of equipment, and for us, they go up to what we call the PCS, or our process control system. So a lot of the alarm notifications go through that, but how you manage the alarms, who's actually acknowledging these alarms and commenting on them and pulling the correct quality records, whether it's a deviation because we're outside of specification and we have to investigate why this happened, or if it's just a nuisance alarm because, they loaded a -80 freezer with, liters of ambient material and we're outside of spec, but it's known, right? So for me, it's how do you rationalize those alarms and make sure that like what actually the parameters that you are alarming on, they make sense and they're actionable. Because what I found, at least in my past, is if you have an alarm right at the specification, as soon as it hits that and you get the alarm, it's out, right? So you'll have no time to react. So if you have a warning alarm, let's say prior to that, that's to use freezers as an example, if you had it at -5 instead of -10 for the alarm, you would be able to actually take some actionable change on that without deviating from your specification.
So would you say that's the not the fix, but the action you took to get ahead of this challenge?
Yes, I would say that's part of it. And then as well as we're going through a huge effort right now to like, do we need alarms for certain things? I think asking yourself that question, like, what are you going to do if you get this alarm? Like, there's a lot of like, oh, well, this is a critical piece of equipment. We have to alarm it. But why? There's someone standing there the whole time it's operating. And it will have a normal, local alarm that if something's going wrong, it will notify the operator that's standing right there. But like, why do you need a notification if someone's there 100% of the time while this equipment is being operated? So I think kind of diving into that. Yeah.
Well, it jumps back to one of the first things you said, challenge the status quo, right?
Yeah.
Someone's there all the time and there's a local alarm. So why do we have to alarm it?
Exactly. And I think it generates a lot of noise, and it generates a lot of like, it hides the fact that there are some alarms that you do need to address or potentially issues that you have. And so I think by removing a lot of that, and what we've kind of done is risk assess a lot of it out, You really get to the heart of like, these are the alarms that we need to be able to respond to, and you know how to respond to them, right? So
Mhm.
I think, actually like asking yourself what you would do if you got this alarm is a really good starting point for any of that stuff.
Love how you challenge these things. Fantastic. So I get one of the final questions for you, Mike, is like everything we're running through. How do you manage your time? How do you manage your time with your team? What do you do with that? Like, how do you structure it?
Yeah. So I'll go over how I personally manage my time first. And I think it comes down to two big buckets of prioritization and tracking. What I like to do either on a Friday or on a Monday first thing is be able to actually list like, what are my needs for the next week? Like, what are the things that I have to do? And then from a delivery perspective, what are the things that are occurring that we're potentially going to have to support? And then there's the nice to haves that like, hey, if I had some spare time, I'd like to, progress this forward or progress
Mhm.
this forward. And being able to like really cut stuff like that as needed, and things change, but having some semblance of a plan for myself going into each week, I feel like makes a big difference. And does it get derailed? Absolutely. But I feel like it allows me to track it at least week over week. And then, it really allows me to at least like put guardrails around what I need to be doing.
Hmm.
And then,
Outstanding.
yeah. And then from a organizational perspective, what I've been focusing on a lot of is automating things, taking the human perspective or the human error out of it, so to speak. Because there's a lot there's a lot of tools that people use, whether it's an Excel tracking spreadsheet, that seems to be a very common one. But anywhere where you can automate it so that people get notifications and they get notified of certain things, I've found to be helpful. So like we utilize a CMMS system for any of the work that is requested through my team. So we ask end users to submit that anytime for anything they need from us, as well as it tracks all of our maintenance, calibrations, anything that's being done to the physical equipment itself. And then even something like badge access to restricted areas that you need training for, like automating that process so that it gets kicked to the appropriate people for approvals and training requirements and all that stuff. So I think for me, trying to automate as much of it as you can will set you up a little bit better for success.
How did you do that, Mike? Was it like that when you showed up? And if yes or no, right? Was that
Mhm.
automation in place when you showed up?
No.
Okay. So how did you actually implement? This is something I know I'm interested in. I'm sure our listeners are. How did you actually implement and roll something like this out? You mentioned
Yeah.
CMMS.
Yeah, so for CMMS, that was something we knew we needed as a business, and so it was a part of like my goal when I first got here to kind of build that business case and get that in place. I've used a number of them in the past, but there's one that I felt had really good out of the box functionality. So I proposed that one. It was approved by the project team, and then we implemented it shortly after. But for something a little less, like something that you can't spend money on, because I know there's a lot of people out there that um, you don't have the budget to buy a big system to put in place to manage certain things.
Sure.
So a lot of the stuff that I've been implementing now is on a much smaller scale. Like let's take access requests for another big one. We had stacks and stacks and stacks of these paper forms granting people access to different areas of the facility. And what we're doing now is I kind of reached out to our IT counterparts. I told them what I wanted to do. I was like, I really want to automate this. I don't want to have to track these forms anymore. I don't want to have to archive these because it's expensive and all this sort of stuff, and just kind of like laid out what I thought we needed to do. And then we were able to kind of get it down to like, okay, so who needs to be involved? What questions we need to ask? How do we get this workflow functionality within just, your basic Microsoft suite? And so through partnering with him and kind of, kicking the tires on potential solutions where I didn't have to be the one physically signing, it just gets kicked to certain people and they approve or don't approve and they can comment why. So I think it's just a lot of just like asking the question, challenging the status quo, and trying to just be curious if there's any better ways to do stuff. Because I can tell you the way not to do stuff is to have several binders filled with access request forms, and it's just a lot of paperwork to deal with.
I'm guessing your team and everyone that you work with and everyone that you touch appreciates all this automation you're putting in place.
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, it makes everybody's lives easier, to be honest. So it definitely makes an impact on our team, but there's other stakeholders as well that have, seen the benefits, and it just makes the more you can, again, like I said, take out the human factor, but then also automate things. It really does,
Mhm.
streamline things.
So we talked a bit earlier, Mike,
Mhm.
and I think you'd be a great person to speak on the topic and help others who might be facing it or have already gone through it. What are some best practices? What are your experiences in terms of integrating companies that have bought each
Yeah,
other?
definitely. Yeah, I've gone through this a couple of times. But one of the biggest things I've taken out of it is there's always this sense of like unknown when it comes to it because you don't know, are you going to have to abide by the parent company's systems? Are you going to have to, do work a different way? Like, who do I need to talk to? And then you'll see a lot of like the senior leadership structure change, at least in my experience, that it has been. And so I think like taking a deep breath and realizing that like you're not going to know everything today is critical because I know how people can kind of spin on things and the way that you're getting communicated to from the either the new organization or the one that you're currently in might not be as much information as you want, and that might just be because they don't have it right now because they're
Mhm.
still working through what that's going to look like and who's going to report to who and transition plans and all that stuff. So I think it's important to recognize that like the reason you might not be getting that information is because it doesn't exist right now. And then also, I think as you kind of go through the process of integrating with a larger company is just kind of figuring out what they require of you, so to speak, because they might just say, "Hey, we want you to operate as is with your own systems that you've already qualified and you're already using, so we don't really want to interrupt operations." And I've been a part of that. But I've also been a part of integrations where it's like, "Oh no, we need you to use this this system or this." And so I think trying to find the person who can get you those answers as soon as they can, so you can start planning.
Mm.
And I've always found you have to be proactive about that because it's not something that I think they tend to give willingly. It's something you have to ask for or ask who to talk to kind of get to those answers. And I think the more you're proactive about it, the earlier you can plan and the smoother it'll end up being. Because I've also had scenarios where we didn't get that information, and then you have to pivot on a tighter timeline, and the impact is greater to not only operations but just anyone who has to use that type of that system that you need to implement. So definitely
I'm
be
hearing
proactive.
absolutely, and I'm hearing a very common theme in every single topic we've talked about is ask more questions. You're constantly challenging and you're asking more questions. Not a lot of people will, but a lot of people will not always just challenge that status quo. And I applaud you for doing so. And I'm sure your team does too, Mike. It's great.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think that's critical, and I think again the be curious thing that just sticks with me.
All right. So we've learned a ton from you, and I mean a ton. We just covered an extraordinary amount of material. Thank you. So we've learned a lot from you. Let's learn a little bit about you, Mike. I'm sure I know I want to know more about you, and I'm sure those listeners out there would like to know about you too. So outside of work, when you're not doing all of this stuff, how do you spend your time?
Yeah, I got some hobbies that I've been into recently. I do a lot of sports with friends and colleagues, like flag football, softball, pickleball more recently, and golf's the big one I'm trying to get better at. I'm currently not that great, so but then I also travel a ton to do some snowboarding. So I go to Utah at least a couple times a year, and been trying to get to some different mountains out west and even in Canada. And then also something interesting that I've been planning on the side is kind of getting more into investment real estate opportunities and potentially even as early as this winter, trying to see if I can get my real estate license as well. So been studying up for that.
Awesome. What was the inspiration for that? How'd that start?
So during COVID, I owned a condo and I realized that I wanted to be a little bit close to the city. So I ended up moving in there and I was renting that out. And then, when prices skyrocketed, I ended up selling it and doing okay for myself. And I was like, I kind of liked the whole like landlord ownership, property ownership type of it. And I think it falls in line a lot with like the facilities operations as a whole, right? Like it's all the same
Mm-hmm.
stuff. It's,
Mm-hmm.
taking care of systems, taking care of that sort of stuff, taking care of it's all very parallel. So I think it's always been something that I've been interested in, and COVID just kind of sparked it with how the housing market boomed, and so I think that's kind of where it started.
Good for you. I wish you nothing but the best with that.
No, thank you. I appreciate it.
Cool. Um, Thank you so much for being on the show today, Mike. Really appreciate you investing your time. Really, really good insights into everything. Thank you very, very much.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks, Jay. Appreciate it.
Of course. And I want to thank everyone who's listening. If you learned something today from Mike, if you laughed a little bit, tell someone else about the show. Mike, thank you again. And it's been a great episode of Facility Rockstars. We'll see everyone next time. It's a wrap. Another episode of Facility Rockstars is in the books. Facility Rockstars is sponsored by Colutus, operating the way you operate in order to make your life easier. Until next time, facilitate and rock on.